Patch 1.3 introduced a number of new weapons, and one of the more interesting additions was the PP-19 SMG. In this video, I'm going to answer the most important questions that you might have about this new weapon, including its core stats and how they compare to other SMGs, how to mod it, is the Hurried talent any good, and is it better than the best in slot MP7? Stick around. The PP-19 is based on the Bison SMG, which I learned while researching its origins was in fact invented by the Kalashnikov group, the same group that invented the AK-47. Interestingly enough, the design team was actually led by Viktor Kalashnikov, the son of Mikhail Kalashnikov, the inventor of the AK-47, and also Alexei Dragunov, who was the youngest son of Evgeny Dragunov, who was the guy that invented the SVD sniper rifle that also made it into the game in Patch 1.3. Clearly, weapons are a family business for these guys, and it's amazing to think that these two families have been responsible for creating some of the most respected and widely used weapons in the modern era. The Bison, or the PP-19 as I'll be referring to it from here, was always intended for close-range tactical combat, and its defining feature is its drum-style magazine sitting underneath the barrel of the weapon. In the game, the PP-19 lives up to both of these defining characteristics, with its low optimal range and the drum magazine prohibiting the use of an underbarrel mod to help manage the weapon's stability. It feels and sounds great, but does it stack up versus other automatic weapons? Well, let's take a detailed look at its stats. To start with the most obvious one, its per bullet damage, we see that the PP-19 has what we might call mid-range per bullet performance, being above the SMG-9 and the MP5, on par with the Vector and the AUG, and below the slower firing T821. Looking at its rate of fire, we see that it sits towards the bottom end of the spectrum, with its 700 RPM being faster than the very slow T821, but slower than any other type of SMG. Its optimal range is on par with most other SMGs at 16 meters. But where the PP-19 really sets itself apart is with its mag size, a massive 53 bullets in the base mag compared to the next best option, which has 32 bullets for the SMG-9 and the MP5 and also the T821. 21 extra bullets is a big deal when we apply the typical magazine mod, bringing your total mag size to around 106. In recognition of this significantly larger mag size, the weapon's reload speed has the slowest of all SMGs at clocking in at 2.35 seconds, compared to the next slowest option, the MP5 and the AUG at 2.1 seconds. But in reality, a difference of 0.25 of a second is borderline indistinguishable and more than a fair trade-off for such a massive magazine size. So let's be clear about what mag size actually means in-game. In essence, the larger the mag size, the longer you can fire the weapon without having to reload. This sounds like a really straightforward concept until you introduce the concept of burst DPS into the mix. Burst DPS is a concept that essentially says that if you never had to reload, how much damage would you be doing, right? That's the question that it asks. We talk about burst DPS because as a cover-based shooter, we naturally need to take cover to avoid enemy fire, which generally affords us ample time to reload our weapons. When we pop out of cover, we want each second that we're out of cover to deal maximum damage, particularly in a PvP environment where burst DPS is significantly more important than sustained DPS, since we want to bring down our target as quickly as possible. So the way that weapons are balanced in the Division, generally speaking, is that if they have a larger magazine, they generally have slower rates of fire and base damage, as their intent is to deal their damage slowly over longer patterns of fire. Weapons with smaller mags, like the MP7 with its base mag of 20 bullets, are built for burst DPS, having very high per bullet damage and rates of fire to offset their tiny magazines. The complicating factor in all of this when talking about the PP-19, however, is that its baked-in talent, Hurried, reduces your reload speed by 10% every time you crit, reducing it to a minimum reload speed of 1 second. Given that you've got a magazine of typically around 100 bullets, and that it only takes 10 crits to get this to stack to its maximum, you can pretty much count on this always being up whenever you are using this weapon. Faster reload speed is a very large DPS increase, make no mistake about that. While you aren't dealing any more per bullet damage, you are firing more bullets per second since you are spending less time reloading. And the value of this talent alone improves the PP-19's sustained DPS by around 20%, which is really huge. So those of you wondering whether or not this is a good talent, yes, absolutely it is. If PvE is your thing, then there are going to be very few talents that will up your DPS by a straight 20%, so don't underestimate this one. And this really is where we get to the crux of the question around how good the PP-19 is. Essentially, it's an excellent weapon if your aim is to deal sustained DPS, particularly in a PvE setting. In PvE, targets have a lot of health, and unless we are fully buffed up, it typically takes around 2 magazines of ammo to drop one target. In this context, the PP-19 with its larger magazine and its super quick reload speed provided by the Hurried talent does really well, and it will literally out DPS any other SMG in the game by a country mile. And to be sure about that, I've actually modeled the DPS for all SMG types in the description below, assuming a 40% crit chance, 100% critical hit damage, 60% headshot accuracy, and 100% headshot damage. Here you can see the modeled sustained DPS for all SMG types, and we see that the longer we fire, the better the PP-19 does, and by a significant margin. If PvE is your thing and you like to use SMGs, then the PP-19 with Hurried is a first-class choice that you really won't be able to beat. But then of course we get to the other side of the coin, burst DPS. In PvP, the SMG is still a weapon of choice due to its excellent accuracy, stability, and its hard-hitting crits. And in PvP, you really want your weapon to drop your target ASAP, so this works really well. Reloading is of course a regular feature of PvP, no doubt about that, especially with how high everyone's toughness has become, but you still want to do as much damage to your target in as little time as possible to give you the highest possible chance of dropping them before they have the chance to react. So when we talk about burst DPS, the PP-19 really isn't a contender. As you can see here, it sits just below the majority of other SMGs and well below the MP7 with its incredible rate of fire and per bullet damage, making it an absolute monster in PvP settings. The numbers here are pretty stark and they really speak for themselves. The PP-19 is a first-rate PvE weapon and the best SMG you will find, propped up by the excellent Hurried talent, giving you excellent DPS throughput, while in PvP, most other SMGs are just straight up better. The PP-19 is by no means bad in PvP, it's just less than optimal, so do keep that in mind when you choose what to go with. So in a moment, we're going to talk about how to mod the PP-19, but before we do that, I just want to finalize this point I was making about this being the best SMG in PvE contexts. Now, I've done a fair amount of the underground at this point, and I've done a little bit of the DZ. I've really been focused on the underground and like making too many YouTube videos, but in my view, and this is just my personal view, but I really think that the current PvE meta is very incompatible with SMGs and has really shifted towards favoring other weapons far more. In short, I think the increased health of enemies make them significantly harder to bring down before we're able to stop them from being a threat to us. And their significant increase in damage output means that they now have the ability to drop us in 1 or 2 shots, even if we're sitting at around 400k toughness or more, which is what I'm generally running with these days. More often than not, I'm finding my team members and I are playing a much safer, sort of sitting back and sniping from a distance style of play with either an LMG, a marksman rifle, or an assault rifle, wearing down enemies slowly or waiting for them to eventually come to us for an easy kill. When they do make their approach, the enemies I mean, I really can't rely on an SMG to bring that target down before it kills me, so I'm actually finding I'm relying a lot more on my SASG shotgun, which does an excellent job of keeping enemies staggered while dealing really exceptional damage. The optimal range of the SMG, which sits at around 15 meters, is, in my view, really not a very smart way to play the game at this point. It used to be that content was really a lot more balanced than it is now, and we could kind of take a few hits before dropping, which allowed us to play a lot more recklessly by getting up inside SMG range. Now, I think that prospect is a little bit too risky, and the buffs to LMGs and assault rifles make them both more damage efficient and far safer to use, and the buffs to shotguns, including their base damage increase and their stagger, make them a really fantastic option for keeping incoming rusher enemies at bay. But again, that's my view, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that, in terms of how you're playing, because for me, I'm actually seeing the SMG going from, being the most used weapon in PvE to being in fact the least used, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing given that we've been using them for so long, but it's nonetheless, I think, a really interesting concept, sort of contrast given where we were just a few short weeks ago. Alright, so finally, how do we mod a PP-19 to get the most out of it? Well, first of all, let's talk stability. You may think that, it's a bit of a drawback that the PP-19 doesn't have an underbarrel mod slot, but you'd actually be mistaken because this thing is damn stable. Here you can see me firing the weapon naked. That is the weapon, by the way, not me. And without correcting for any of the recoil, you see that the weapon has very little left or right movement or vertical climb. It's an exceptionally stable weapon right out of the box, and given that you're typically going to be using this weapon at very close quarters, you really don't need to invest in stability in order to get the most out of it. In that context, I'd recommend headshot damage and critical hit chance in the optical slot, and perhaps accuracy and crit chance on the muzzle. Now remember, on an SMG, you need to drop some crit into it in order to unlock the value of the baked-in critical hit damage that you get for free. So don't skimp out on your crit, but don't go too crazy if you're likely to be running with someone who'll be giving you a fully stacked pulse. For the magazine slot, I really recommend going for rate of fire. Yes, you will push out more sustained DPS with a % weapon damage mod, no question about that. But just as I've discussed, I really think that if you are brave enough to use an SMG in the current PvE meta, then you're going to want to sort of pop out, really quickly dump your magazine, and then get straight back into cover to reload and heal up. The fact that the stability of the weapon is so great and makes it easier to handle sort of this increased rate of fire is really awesome as well. So it's actually a really natural fit here. And that's it, everyone. That's my take on the PP-19. Like the SVD marksman rifle, the PP-19 is actually a very strong addition to the overall arsenal. It's clearly the strongest PvE SMG, but as I've said, you may find it tricky to safely use given how hard NPCs are hitting these days. In PvP, you're better off going for an MP7, but if you can't get your hands on that, then pretty much any other SMG will actually be a better choice, to be honest. The PP-19 is definitely not built for burst DPS. Mod it for things like critical hit chance and critical hit damage, as at the intended range, the built-in stability and accuracy all combine to make a weapon that is, very easy to handle. And do mod it for rate of fire to give yourself some extra punch when you pop out of cover. Guys, I hope you found this review useful, and if you did, please do drop it a like, as it helps me out in a very big way. And if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, you can hit that subscribe button now for lots more Division theory crafting content. Coming out this week, I've actually got my very first proper Overwatch video. I've got a Reaper video coming through, and I'll be doing more Overwatch stuff in future. I'll be doing my regular state of the game highlights and one or two other Division videos, which I'm sort of scripting up right now, and I'll tell you more about those later on. But thanks very much for watching, guys. I always appreciate your time. Take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the Dark Zone. Bye-bye.